Hi, this is Sam Weigel with FlyInn Magazine's V1 Rotate web series. Now, most of the time, V1 Rotate is aimed at new and aspiring professional pilots, but for January and February, we're doing something special, bringing you longer adventure episodes that are sure to appeal to all pilots and aviation enthusiasts. Last month, we brought you to Baja, Mexico, recounting a flying trip that my wife Dawn and I did in 2016 with our Piper Pacer. This month, we're bringing you to New Zealand, where Dawn and I just got back from a month-long adventure that included a spectacular week exploring the South Island with a Cessna 172. Enjoy this special episode of V1 Rotate New Zealand by air. New Zealand is a small, lightly populated country tucked away in a remote corner of the world. It wasn't even inhabited by humans until only 700 years ago. And yet, New Zealand has a strong presence in our collective consciousness. It is the home of the haka, a vibrant Maori indigenous culture. It is home to the world's best rugby players and the world's best sailors. It is the domain of the kiwi and of many other fascinating endemic species of flora and fauna that evolved in complete isolation. It is the birthplace of adventure tourism. It is a land of epic landscapes, of fire and ice, of rainforests and misty fjords. It has become our stand-in for J.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth. All these are reasons why so many people from around the world make the long journey to see New Zealand for themselves. For pilots, there's even more reason to visit. New Zealand's relatively late development, thinly spread population, rugged terrain, and dependence on agriculture and tourism have all encouraged the development of a robust general aviation infrastructure. Many of the most spectacular parts of the country have few or no roads, but are relatively near populated areas at GA speeds. All this makes New Zealand a spectacular flight-seeing destination for pilots, and it's been on my list a long time. When the country finally opened up after being shut down for COVID-19 for over 2 years, Dawn and I decided it was time to make our long-planned New Zealand adventure a reality. We started our trip in Auckland on the North Island. If you're a sailor or follow the America's Cup, Auckland is something of a mecca. For everyone else, it's just another big city. We didn't stay here long before our friends Brad and Amber Phillips flew in, whereupon we collected a couple of Toyota RAV4s with rooftop tents and headed south on that classic New Zealand institution, the camper van road trip. The next 2 weeks would have been a pretty great vacation on their own. We spent 6 days touring the North Island, from tourist hotspots like Rotorua, Tongariro National Park, and Wellington, as well as more out-of-the-way areas like the Coromandel Peninsula, the surf town of Mount Maunganui, and sunny Napier. And then on a windy, stormy day, we crossed the Cook Strait to the South Island. Over the next 8 days, we sipped Sauvignon Blanc in Marlborough, tramped the spectacular coastal trail in Abel Tasman National Park, toured the wild, rain-swept west coast, and camped and hiked in truly spectacular Aoraki Mount Cook National Park. All too soon, though, it was over, and we said goodbye to our friends in Christchurch before flying Air New Zealand to the adventure tourism hotspot of Queenstown. We had seen New Zealand by land and by sea. Now, it was time to see her by air. Our flying tour began the next morning at Queenstown Airport, where we were met by friendly Kiwi flight instructor Matt McCoggan. Matt and his wife Jo are fourth-generation sheep and cattle ranchers, and they are also owners of FlyInn, billed as the authentic New Zealand self-fly vacation. We met Matt and Jo in Oshkosh a few years ago and quickly bonded over our shared passion for long-distance sailing, of all things. FlyInn has 2 well-maintained Cessna 172s upgraded with 180 horsepower engines, which is useful for the sort of mountain flying we'd be doing. They tend to keep the airplanes together for safety reasons, so we were accompanied by Adam and Lisa Broom of Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Adam circumnavigated the globe with his Beach Bonanza in 2016, which he has a lot of interesting stories about. Dawn and I were assigned pretty yellow and blue Whiskey Alpha X-Ray and started with Matt in the right seat, while Adam and Lisa drew Tango Romeo Sierra and flew with cheerful instructor Nick Taylor for most of their tour. Normally, FlyInn's 8-day tour starts with an easy familiarization day, but early December is springtime on the South Island with notoriously volatile weather. The spectacularly rugged southwestern region of Fiordland is particularly subject to low ceilings and rain, but we had a fleeting weather window with supposedly good VFR, so Matt moved up our exploration of Milford Sound and Fiordland to the first day. What little I knew of Milford Sound, I was pretty sure this was throwing me into the deep end of the pool straight away. Sink or swim. We snuck out of busy jet-trafficked Queenstown Airport for a quick 20-minute flight north to Wanaka, our base of exploration for the week. We had coffee there and talked about our plan for the day, then departed to the northwest, over the town and the serrated deep blue waters of Lake Wanaka. We climbed through the verdant Matukituki Valley towards 10,000-foot Mount Aspiring, known as the Matterhorn of the South. Circling the peak and ridges and the glaciers clinging to its flanks and their aquamarine terminal lakes, my wonder was tempered by the solid undercast stretching between here and the coast. Matt thought there'd be a good hole further southwest, and indeed there was, which let us drop down into the Pyke River Valley and follow that north to our next destination, Big Bay. There's a seasonal fishing camp and a hiker's hut at Big Bay, but no airport. It's reachable via a 5-day walk from the nearest road, or by landing on the broad beach just after high tide, which is what we did. We shut down and got out, had a tramp around and donned our life vests, then took off again and followed a series of headlands stretching to the south. Our next destination, world-famous Milford Sound. Approaching Dale Point, the entrance to the sound looked foreboding, with restricted visibility and rain. Matt noted that it's usually better towards the head of the sound, but I stuck close to the right side in case we had to turn around. In fact, we soon broke out into sunshine, waterfalls, rainbows, and magnificent views. Nearing Milford Airport at the head of the sound, the sea breeze picked up sharply, gusting to 30 knots. The approach to runway 29 involved descending into the Cleddau River Valley, reversing course at the Tatuco River confluence, and making a dogleg final, minding the pronounced downdraft over the riverbank. We got bashed around pretty good the whole way in, and my landing was not pretty. It was safe, that's all. And with that, we were at majestic, world-famous Milford Sound. Pictures don't do it justice.
Alright, excitement.
After lunch and a nice walk around, we departed Milford, following the strict published routing and with Matt making regular position reports. The ride was rough until we turned around and ducked down the Arthur River Valley, which was both calmer and fantastically scenic. We followed the Milford Track, a popular 3-day hike up towards McKinnon Pass. Just beyond, at a bend in the valley, lies the impressive 2,000-foot Sutherland Falls, once thought to be the world's tallest. It flows from what appears to be a rock-walled thimble of a tarn, Lake Quill. Matt asked if I wanted to fly around Lake Quill, and of course I thought he was crazy, and he knew I'd think he was crazy. He reassured me that there's a lot more room than it looks. Just put out 20 degrees of flaps and slow to 65 knots, which is good advice in most tight mountain flying situations. So I did, and indeed, there is a lot more room than it looks. It's honestly one of the neatest things I've ever done in an airplane. And then we dove out and Adam drove in with Tango Romeo Sierra, and seeing the tiny 172 buzz into the entrance really drove home the absolutely epic scale of the landscape we were exploring. It was a really neat moment. The next hour was spent poking through Fjordland's endless maze of mountains and valleys, lakes and rivers and fjords, trying to find a series of passes clear enough to get us down to Doubtful Sound, perfectly named by Captain James Cook himself. We eventually got there via McPherson Pass and the Gare Arm, then turned up the Malaspina Reach and Deep Cove to Wilmot Pass. That took us down to Lake Manapuri, which we crossed to land at the Teanu Airport on the other side for a much-needed break. Finally, we flew back northeast to Wanaka, crossing Lake Wakatipu west of Queenstown. By the time we landed in the late afternoon, I was exhausted, exhilarated, and in bad need of a cigar, a glass of scotch, and 8 solid hours of sleep. It was the most visually intense day of flying I've ever experienced, and a lot more work than I'm used to in airplanes these days. And it was only the first day of our tour.
Well done.
That night, Joe emailed to say that due to the weather window still holding, we'd be headed up to the Mount Cook area the very next day. I thought this was a bit like moving straight from the caviar to the creme brulee, and I wasn't wrong. We started our day with short field practice on a 1,500-foot farm strip on the shores of Lake Wanaka. It was located in an apparently unused cow pasture, but shortly after landing, I discovered the cows had been there pretty recently. After that, we jinked over to Lake Hawea and headed north via the scenic Hunter River Valley. The further north we got, though, the windier it got, and with more cloud cover. This wasn't unexpected. The wind forecast for the Mount Cook area included gusts to 30 knots. Back home, I stay out of the mountains with a forecast like that. But I was quickly finding that wind and turbulence and socked-in passes and rain showers are all just daily facts of life for Kiwi pilots. They're good at dealing with marginal conditions because they're taught how early in their training. For me, the variable weather made this trip not just a nice sightseeing tour, but a real challenge that honed my skills as a pilot. In this case, it helps that I have my glider rating and a bit of experience with ridge soaring. In high winds, the smoothest air in a valley is often found on the downwind slope in the area of steadiest ridge lift. This is also handy when trying to clear high terrain or when trying to gain altitude through a hole in an overcast. As we worked our way north, the Mount Cook Massif started to take shape, and I started to see familiar landmarks from our earlier camping and hiking in the area. Mount Sefton, which had towered above our campsite in a rocky Mount Cook National Park, slipped beneath our right wing. Our hikes had taken us within sight of the terminus of the Hooker and Tasman glaciers in the park and the Fox and Franz Josef glaciers on the west coast, but now we saw them in their full glory, emerging from one enormous ice sheet on the shoulder of Mount Cook. At 12,000 feet, Mount Cook is not that lofty by North American standards, but standing athwart the roaring 40s, it punches above its weight as a collector of moisture in frozen form. Like Milford Sound, the Mount Cook area has a great deal of traffic from commercial operators, and there is a designated mandatory broadcast zone. There's also a standard circuit of the sites, but we deviated from it to stay out of severe turbulence. Matt kept the few operators venturing out in these conditions appraised of our position and intentions. Eventually, we descended down the Tasman Glacier and landed at Glen Tanner Aerodrome on the shores of glacial silt-tinted Lake Pukaki for lunch. After lunch, we took off and headed west to Lake Oahu and then up the ranch-dotted Hopkins River Valley. Nearing Mount Glenmary, the northwest winds became increasingly fierce, so we turned up the Huxley River Valley and surfed up the Leeward Slope, clearing the notch just below Mount Huxley and ducking into the calmer Ahuriri River drainage. We followed it south to Civilization and the highway over Linda's Pass, then entered a beautiful Golden Hill Ring Valley with green fields and ranch buildings and an airstrip at the bottom. This is Geordie Hill Station, home to 5 generations of McCoggins and their several thousand head of sheep, as well as 200 head of cattle. When we landed, it was the cattle that were misbehaving. We got to tag along as Matt did some impromptu herding with his Lexus SUV. After a tea break with Joe, we headed back over the hill to Wanaka for the night. For the next few days, Matt had ranch business to take care of, so we inherited Peter Hendricks for an overnight trip to the southeastern coastal city of Dunedin. Peter is a very experienced A-level flight instructor, the New Zealand equivalent of a designated pilot examiner. I would be completing the requirements for my New Zealand PPL validation with him. The wind was still kicking, but at least the terrain was less of a factor today. We headed southeast to Cromwell, then crossed into the Nevis River Valley, and followed it down to the pastoral Southland Plains. That's where we found the quaint little grass strip at Mandeville. The Croydon Aviation Heritage Center is here, with a really cool old-timey restoration workshop and a fantastic collection of airworthy vintage aircraft, particularly 1930s de Havillands. From Mandeville, we headed due south to Waipapa Point on the Southern Ocean, then turned east to fly along the Catlins coast. This 70 miles or so of wild, craggy coastline backed by verdant pasturelands could be straight out of Western Ireland. We flew low over the ocean, but made sure we had the energy to get back to something landable. That water looked cold. It felt like you could almost see to Antarctica along here. As we neared Dunedin, we stayed clear of the international airport's airspace and landed instead at closer in Taieri Aerodrome, yet another lovely grass strip. We had a nice night in Dunedin, an atmospheric college town with a very Scottish flavor, as Scots made up the majority of early immigrants. Don and I had a nice walk around town, then we joined Adam and Lisa, Peter and Nick for an excellent seafood dinner at a local restaurant tucked away behind the seaport. The next morning, we went for a nice 2-hour wildlife watching cruise around Dunedin Harbor and Taiaroa Head, spotting blue penguins, endangered New Zealand sea lions, and the magnificent northern royal albatross. A few hours later, we saw the same area by air as we headed north along the coast to Oamaru, and then back to Wanaka via the braided Pyke River and its system of reservoirs and hydroelectric dams. We were finally weathered out on the 5th day as a strong cold front came up from the Southern Ocean and brought more wind, clouds, and rain than even the Kiwis care to fly in. Instead, Don and I used our free Saturday to explore the historic gold mining towns, vineyards, and wineries of western Otago by car. For day 6, the southwesterly winds were still pumping, but the weather was otherwise good for our short flight over to Glenorchy at the head of Lake Wakatipu. We planned to avoid the worst turbulence by detouring down to Queenstown and hugging the north shore of the lake, but due to jet arrivals down the Kawarau Gorge, Queenstown Tower directed us to stay out over the mountains to the north. So we surfed and bounced our way westward across the Harrison-Richardson Ranges, emerging from Moonlight Saddle above Glenorchy to spiral down over the Dart River and land at yet another beautiful grass strip. We spent the afternoon exploring the shallow braided Dart River via jet boat, a journey that took us 20 miles upriver into beautiful wilderness below Mount Earnslaw. Later, after departing Glenorchy, Peter, Don, and I took Whiskey Alpha X-Ray up the Reese River on the other side of Mount Earnslaw, surfing up the Richardson Range, checking out scenic Loch Noggin and the upper Shotover River watershed, then heading through Shotover Saddle to explore the impossibly scenic Matuki-Tuki River Valley and the perfect semicircular amphitheater of the hanging Rob Roy Glacier. Our last full day of flying was a tour of rural Otago region. Matt was back from his ranching duties, but he flew with Adam and Lisa in Tango Romeo Sierra, while we finally got to fly with Nick Taylor, a super friendly, cheerful chap with a wealth of experience tramping and climbing in the South Island backcountry. Our first stop was Alexandra, Nick's home airport. A friend of his gave us a lift to check out the nearby Gold Rush downtown of Clyde, the start of the popular Otago Rail Trail bicycling route. We actually followed the former rail bed from Alexandra northeast to the Ida Valley and the little hamlet of Oturehua. There's no airport here, but there is a fairly level sheep paddock, so we landed in it. I guess the sheep had been away for a few weeks because the grass was a lot longer than expected. Whiskey Alpha X-Ray proved an excellent lawnmower. We came to visit Hayes Engineering Works, a well-preserved homestead and farm implement factory from the 1890s. The workshop was actually really interesting. The old-timer in charge collected enough of us to justify powering up the works, which was originally done via water power, and which still uses the original DC motor, transmission shafts, and system of leather belts and pulleys. He demonstrated use of the original shears, punch press, lathe, grinding wheel, and more. Pretty neat stuff. After departing the sheep paddock, we had a really nice flight over to Geordie Hill Station, surfing the St. Bathans Range along the way. The winds were pretty swirly landing at Geordie Hill, and we ended up with a pretty healthy tailwind on landing. Matt gave Dawn, Adam, Lisa, and I a more extensive tour of the beautiful 5,500-acre ranch with his Lexus 4x4, demonstrating its rather impressive hill climbing capability. Then, Joe treated us to a wonderful lamb dinner. We sipped local wine and told stories well into the night. Don and I decided to move our departure back by a day to get in some more hiking around Wanaka. First, Lisa and I teamed up for a sunrise climb of scenic Roy's Peak above Lake Wanaka. Then Don and I ventured out into the Matuki-Tuki Valley and Mount Aspiring National Park, hoping to get up to the Rob Roy Glacier we had flown along 2 days prior. The trail turned out to be closed, but we had a lovely walk in the main valley. And that was the end of our New Zealand adventure. It sent us off in typical fashion with a good ass-kicking on our way to Queenstown, where we landed with a healthy crosswind, but we made our Air New Zealand flight up to Auckland and headed home a day later. It was a fantastic trip. Don and I really fell in love with the country, and we intend to return and do more flying there. If you have the time and money to do a flying tour of New Zealand, I highly recommend it. As far as FlyInn goes, their tours are basically all-inclusive and are admittedly pretty expensive. It's a bucket list trip for most people, and it's by far the most that Dawn and I have ever spent on a vacation. There are definitely cheaper and less formally structured ways to tour New Zealand by air. That said, FlyInn is a really well-run operation, and they're quite lovely people as well as excellent instructors. I feel that we got our money's worth. Thanks for watching this special episode of V1 Rotate. We'll be back in March with our normal content aimed at new and aspiring professional pilots. Look for us at flymag.com every first and third Friday of the month.